Mark Collins stared at the latest batch of reports on his screen, his gut tightening. His flagship store, once a top performer, was hemorrhaging both customers and employees. Complaints flooded in, sales plummeted, and staff turnover soared. Yet his regional managers insisted everything was fine. He knew better. Numbers didn't lie. Something was wrong. Leaning back in his chair, he exhaled sharply. If he wanted the truth, he couldn't rely on second-hand reports. He had to see it for himself. And that meant one thing: going undercover. Mark picked up his phone and dialed his assistant. "Lydia, I need a favor." "Of course, sir. What do you need?" "I'm going to that downtown store, but not as the CEO Silence." Then, cautiously, she asked, "Undercover?" "Exactly. I need to see what's really happening. No executive treatment. I want to be hired as a new employee." Lydia didn't question him. "I'll make the arrangements." Hanging up, Mark felt a rush of anticipation. He hadn't worked on the retail floor in years, but he still remembered what it took. Stocking shelves, assisting customers. He had done it all. Now he would step back into that world, not as a leader in a suit, but as a rookie employee. To pull this off, he had to change everything about himself. He spent the evening preparing, growing out his stubble, selecting worn-out clothes, and trading his polished shoes for scuffed sneakers. He even practiced speaking differently, softening the confidence in his voice. By the time he looked in the mirror, his transformation was complete. Gone was Mark Collins, CEO. In his place stood an ordinary retail worker. Tomorrow, he would walk through those store doors unnoticed. No special treatment, no corporate meetings, just a man looking for a job. And by the end of the day, he would have the answers he needed. The fluorescent lights flickered as Mark Collins stepped into the downtown store. His heart pounded, not from excitement, but from the tension of his undercover mission. The last time he had visited, this store had been a thriving flagship location. Now it felt like a disaster zone. Chaos reigned. A long line of frustrated customers snaked around the front, leading to a single exhausted cashier. Shelves were half-stocked, aisles disorganized. Employees moved mechanically, their faces drained of energy. One young worker stood near the clothing racks, glued to his phone, oblivious to the growing tension. Mark's disguise, a scruffy beard, worn-out clothes, thick-rimmed glasses, kept him anonymous as he observed. Then he spotted him. Gary, the store manager, standing near the stockroom, barking orders but doing nothing himself. Mark had read the reports. Employees described Gary as unapproachable and quick to blame others. Seeing him in action confirmed every suspicion. A commotion at the front caught Mark's attention. An elderly customer, growing impatient, snapped at the cashier. "I've been waiting 20 minutes. Where's the manager?" The cashier, on the verge of tears, merely shrugged. Gary didn't intervene. Instead, he smirked from a distance, ignoring the problem. Then, Mark saw her. Anna. She was tirelessly working, rushing between tasks, trying to keep everything together. Her hands shook as she rearranged a display, her body tense with exhaustion. She was the store's backbone, but the weight of mismanagement was crushing her. Mark had read about Anna. The reports called her the store's hardest worker, yet she was on the brink of burnout. Watching her now, he understood why. She assisted customers, restocked shelves, and even helped the overwhelmed cashier, all while Gary stood by, offering no support. His phone buzzed. A message from Lydia. "Everything's set. You're good to go as the new recruit." Mark exhaled. The pieces were falling into place. He wasn't just here to observe anymore. It was time to step into the chaos and see firsthand just how deep the problems ran. For now, he remained in character. Just another new employee, blending into the storm brewing inside the store. The store buzzed with the hum of restless customers and the clatter of employees rushing to complete their tasks. Mark, still maintaining his cover as the new recruit, moved quietly between aisles, trying to absorb every detail of the store's toxic atmosphere. But despite his best efforts to blend in, the weight of what he was witnessing began to settle on him. He couldn't ignore the growing tension that surrounded him, particularly around Anna. She was everywhere, juggling 1,000 tasks, trying to keep things from falling apart. And yet, it was clear that the very system that should have supported her was doing just the opposite. It was nearly 2 p.m. when the first troubling incident occurred. Mark had been working alongside Anna, helping customers with returns and restocking shelves when she suddenly approached Gary, the store manager. She looked weary, her face pale from exhaustion, her shoulders slumped. Mark watched her as she stepped hesitantly toward Gary, who was at the back of the store, directing another employee to carry boxes into the stockroom. "Gary?" Anna said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been working for 7 hours straight without a break. Is it possible for me to take a quick lunch?" Mark could hear the strain in her voice, the exhaustion that had built up over what had likely been weeks of nonstop work. She wasn't asking for much, just a moment to catch her breath. But her request seemed to irritate Gary more than it should have. Gary, standing with his arms crossed, shot Anna a look that could have melted glass. He raised an eyebrow and sighed dramatically, rolling his eyes in a way that conveyed nothing but disdain. "Lunch? Now?" Gary said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You've barely done anything all day and you want a break? You've got boxes to unload. You can eat when you're done. Don't be lazy." Anna's face flushed a deep shade of crimson, her eyes darting nervously toward the pile of stock crates waiting to be emptied. Mark could see the tension building up in her body, but she said nothing more. She simply nodded, turning quickly to gather the crates Gary had ordered her to move. But it was clear she was fighting the urge to snap back, to stand up for herself. Instead, she took the punishment in silence, her shoulders even more slumped as she moved toward the stockroom. Mark's blood boiled. He could feel his own frustration rising as he observed Gary's behavior. How could a manager treat his employee like that, especially when she was clearly at her breaking point? It wasn't just the rude response. It was the way Gary had humiliated her in front of everyone. In a store filled with people, a simple request for rest had been met with mockery and scorn. But Mark knew he had to keep his composure. He needed to see how far this toxic environment stretched. So he stood by, observing in silence, his anger building with every passing moment. Things only seemed to get worse from there. A few minutes later, Mark was stocking shelves near the front of the store when he heard a customer's voice rise above the others. "Excuse me?" the woman shouted, her voice sharp and demanding. "I've been waiting in line for over 20 minutes. Why is there only one cashier? This is ridiculous." Mark turned to look, and he saw the woman standing near the checkout counter, her face red with frustration. She was holding a pair of shoes in her hands, clearly ready to make a purchase. But the long line of customers was moving so slowly that her patience was wearing thin. The lone cashier, who had been trying to manage the line, glanced nervously at the woman, but before she could respond, the customer let out a loud sigh and slammed the shoes onto the counter. "This is the worst service I've ever had," she continued, her voice rising. "Why aren't you doing something about this?" Gary, standing off to the side near the stockroom entrance, didn't even flinch at the commotion. Instead, he smirked, clearly unconcerned. He turned to another employee, a young man who had been standing idly by, and started speaking to him in a low voice, completely ignoring the situation. Anna, who had been in the stockroom, emerged just as the woman's complaints grew louder. Mark could see the discomfort in Anna's posture as she approached the register. She took a deep breath, trying to mask the exhaustion and frustration she must have been feeling, but it was obvious she was walking into a hornet's nest. The customer was still shouting. "You people are so disorganized," she snapped, now turning her ire toward Anna, who had just come to the front to assist. "I can't believe I've waited this long just for someone to ring me up. You should be ashamed of yourselves." Anna tried to keep her composure, offering the woman a strained smile. "I'm really sorry for the wait, ma'am," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "We've had some staffing issues today, but I'll take care of you right now." But the customer wasn't having any of it. She snapped back, "Don't give me that excuse. I don't care about your staffing issues. It's your job to make sure the store runs smoothly. Why don't you get your manager to do something for a change?" Mark could see Anna's face harden with a mix of frustration and humiliation. But before she could respond, Gary finally stepped in, but not to help. Instead, he gave Anna a dismissive glance and muttered, "She's just a customer. Let her talk. You're not going to fix it by getting upset." The customer scoffed and huffed, and Gary turned his back, returning to his conversation with the other employee. Anna's eyes flickered with disbelief, but she said nothing. The sting of humiliation was evident, even though she was trying to hold it together. Mark couldn't stand it any longer. He had been watching quietly up until this point, but the combination of Anna's mistreatment, Gary's indifference, and the customer's harsh words pushed him to his limit. As he saw Anna struggling to maintain her professionalism, her face a mix of shame and exhaustion, Mark knew it was time to act. He could no longer sit idly by. His gut told him that this store, this environment, was broken beyond repair. The leadership was toxic, and the employees were paying the price for it. It was no longer just about the sales numbers or customer complaints. It was about the people who made the store function, who were being crushed under the weight of poor management. And Anna, who had shown so much resilience, was the most heartbreaking example of it all. As the customer finally paid for her items and stormed out, Mark found himself clenching his fists in frustration. He needed to do something about this. He wasn't sure what, but he knew that if this continued, the entire store, along with its dedicated employees, would collapse under the pressure. And Mark wouldn't let that happen. Not on his watch. The atmosphere in the store had only gotten worse since Mark's initial observations. It felt like a ticking time bomb, with tensions building between the employees, the customers, and the oppressive management. Mark could see it on Anna's face every time she passed by. Her exhaustion, her frustration, and her fear. It was clear that the pressure had become unbearable for her, and the breaking point was approaching fast. Mark had been watching from the sidelines, taking mental notes of every incident. He had witnessed Anna's countless hours of hard work, her attempts to please every customer, and her willingness to go above and beyond, all for a job that seemed to reward her with nothing but scorn. But nothing had prepared him for what he saw next. It happened just as the store was beginning to quiet down for the evening. The late afternoon rush had finally subsided, and most of the employees were either at the register or tending to their sections. Mark was near the back of the store, pretending to sort through boxes, but his attention was fixed on the front where Anna and Gary were exchanging words. Gary was standing by the cash registers, his arms crossed and a smug expression on his face. Anna was standing in front of him, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the clipboard in her hands. Mark could hear their conversation clearly from where he stood, and what he overheard made his stomach churn. "Anna?" Gary's voice was cold, almost mocking. "You really don't get it, do you? You've been here how long now, and still, you can't even handle a simple task. You can't even be bothered to keep up with the rest of the team. I swear, you're just a liability. No wonder you're stuck here working a dead-end job. You'll never move up from this." Mark's heart sank as he watched Anna's face falter. She stood there, struggling to maintain her composure, but it was evident that Gary's words were sinking in. She tried to speak, but Gary didn't let her. Instead, he continued his tirade, his voice getting louder, making sure the entire team could hear. "You're stupid, Anna. You'll never get a better job than this. No one else is going to tolerate someone as useless as you. I don't know how you even made it this far," he sneered, his words cutting deeper with each passing second. "If you had any self-respect, you'd quit already, but of course, you're too afraid to leave. You're stuck here because no one else wants you." Anna's face flushed with a mixture of hurt and disbelief. Mark could see her hands start to shake more visibly now, and her eyes were wide, holding back the tears that seemed poised to spill over. She opened her mouth, but the words never came. Instead, She stood there, trembling, taking the verbal blows in silence. The room felt suffocating. Mark had had enough. He could feel the anger rise in his chest, a fury so intense that it almost burned. It wasn't just that Gary was being cruel. Mark had seen cruelty before. But this was something else. This was abuse disguised as authority, a power play by someone who felt the need to belittle others in order to feel superior. He couldn't let this go on any longer. Without thinking, Mark took a few steps forward, his footsteps steady and purposeful. His eyes never left Gary, who was still in the middle of his tirade. The other employees were beginning to notice, their heads slowly turning toward the confrontation, unsure of what to expect. But Mark wasn't concerned with them. His focus was entirely on Gary. "Enough," Mark's voice rang out across the store. It wasn't loud, but it was firm, carrying with it an authority that silenced the entire room. Gary stopped mid-sentence, turning his head sharply toward Mark, confusion and annoyance flashing across his face. "What did you say?" Gary snapped, clearly irritated that someone had interrupted his moment of dominance. Mark's eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched with determination. "I said enough, Gary." The room went completely still. Even the employees seemed to freeze, their attention now fully on Mark and the confrontation that was about to unfold. Gary's confusion quickly shifted to defensiveness. "Who the hell are you to interrupt me?" He took a step toward Mark, clearly not recognizing him. "I'm someone who doesn't tolerate bullying," Mark replied coldly. His gaze was unflinching, locked onto Gary. "And I don't care who you think you are. What you just said to Anna was completely unacceptable." Gary blinked, taken aback by Mark's response. For a moment, he was silent, trying to assess the situation. Mark could feel the eyes of the entire staff on him now. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Anna was still standing in the same spot, her face pale, her hands still trembling. She had no idea what was about to happen. "You think I'm out of line?" Gary sneered, taking a step back and crossing his arms over his chest. "This is none of your business. I'm the manager here. I know how to run this store. If Anna can't handle a little criticism, that's on her." Mark's eyes flashed with fury. "That's where you're wrong, Gary. You think you're the boss here, but all you're doing is destroying this place. You've just insulted your best employee, someone who works harder than anyone else in this store, and you've done it in front of everyone. You don't get to talk to people like that." Gary was growing visibly uncomfortable, but he didn't back down. "You don't know what you're talking about. You think you can come in here and—" Mark interrupted him, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "I know exactly what I'm talking about. You just called Anna stupid. You told her she'd never get a better job. You humiliated her in front of the entire staff. And I'm telling you right now, that's going to be the last thing you do here." Gary's eyes widened in realization as Mark stepped forward, pulling off his cheap glasses and revealing his corporate ID, a symbol of his authority within the company. He watched as the faces of the employees around him slowly turned from confusion to shock. Gary's face drained of color as he stammered, trying to piece together what was happening. You're Mark Collins," Gary stammered, his voice trembling. "That's right," Mark said with a cold smile. "And you just lost your job." The silence that followed was deafening. No one moved, no one spoke. The employees stood frozen, unsure of how to react. Gary, now visibly shaken, opened his mouth to say something, anything, but the words never came. Mark was already a step ahead. "You're fired, Gary," Mark said firmly. "You're a disgrace to this company, and I will make sure you don't work another day in any of our stores." Gary stood there, mouth agape, unable to defend himself. He knew he had lost. There was nothing more to say. Mark turned to Anna, who was still standing there, her expression a mix of disbelief and relief. "Anna," he said softly, "you're not going anywhere. You're a great employee. and you deserve better than this. I'll make sure of it." The entire store seemed to exhale collectively as Mark walked toward the front of the store. Gary was already retreating, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Mark had no interest in chasing after him. The damage was done, and the truth had been revealed. It was a turning point for everyone in that store. A moment when the wrongs were righted and the balance of power shifted. The events of that fateful afternoon unfolded quickly, leaving the employees and even Mark himself in stunned silence. The realization of what had just happened began to settle in, but Mark wasn't about to let things rest there. The injustice that had played out in the store needed to be fully rectified, and he was determined to ensure that the changes that followed would make the environment a place of fairness, respect, and productivity. Mark's first step was to make sure that the toxic influence of Gary was completely eradicated. As soon as the confrontation had ended and the shock of the moment began to subside, Mark turned to the staff and made his intentions clear. "Effective immediately, Gary is no longer employed here," Mark stated, his voice firm and decisive. There was no room for negotiation. Gary's behavior had been an insult to the values of the company, and Mark wasn't about to let that go unpunished. The room was filled with stunned silence, and then a ripple of quiet relief swept through the employees. They knew it had been coming, but to witness Gary's downfall in such a public and undeniable way was satisfying in a way words couldn't fully describe. For Anna, the relief was palpable. The manager who had made her life miserable for so long was gone, and with it, a weight seemed to lift from her shoulders. After Gary had left the store, Mark turned his attention to the next important matter, Anna. He walked over to where she was standing by the counter, still processing the whirlwind of events that had unfolded. She looked up as he approached, her face a mix of confusion and gratitude. "Anna," Mark began softly, his voice sincere, "you've been through more than anyone should ever have to endure at work. I've seen the way you've been treated, and I want you to know that things are about to change." Anna's eyes widened. She had been waiting for a moment like this, but now that it was happening, she felt overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I mean," Mark said, "that you're going to be promoted. Effective immediately, you will take over as the store's new lead employee. You've earned it, Anna. And not only that, you'll also be getting a pay raise, effective this pay cycle." The words didn't immediately register with Anna. She blinked several times, processing the magnitude of what Mark had just said. She had never imagined this kind of outcome, especially not after everything she had been through. "You're giving me a promotion?" Anna finally asked, her voice trembling. Mark nodded. "You've shown nothing but dedication, hard work, and resilience. You deserve to be recognized, and I'm making sure that happens. This store needs someone like you leading it, someone who cares about the employees and the customers alike." The smile that spread across Anna's face was genuine, a mixture of disbelief and joy. It was the kind of smile Mark had hoped to see from the start. One of pride, not pain. She had been given a second chance, and it was one that she would seize with everything she had. But the changes didn't stop with Anna's promotion. Mark knew that for the store to truly improve, there had to be structural changes as well. He couldn't leave the store in the hands of a new leader alone and hope for things to improve. The atmosphere had been toxic for too long, and it was time for a complete overhaul. "From this point forward," Mark continued, addressing the entire staff, "we're going to make things right. I've already made arrangements to hire additional staff. We'll be increasing the number of shifts and improving the working conditions. We'll also be introducing a bonus system that rewards hard work, and we're raising the salaries across the board. You all deserve better, and I'm committed to providing that." The employees exchanged glances, disbelief still hanging in the air. Mark wasn't just talking about minor adjustments. He was committing to a fundamental transformation of the way the store operated. For years, they had worked in conditions that drained them, and for the first time, someone in authority was acknowledging their struggles and promising real change. Over the next few weeks, the store began to take shape in a way it never had before. The turnover rate dropped as the employees felt more valued and respected. The shelves were stocked in an organized, efficient manner. Customer complaints began to decrease as the staff became more motivated and capable. And most importantly, the morale of the team soared. Anna quickly took to her new role with confidence and skill, her leadership style a stark contrast to the oppressive management of Gary. She listened to her colleagues, took initiative to solve problems, and fostered an environment of mutual respect. The store began to thrive under her guidance. Weeks went by, and Mark stayed in close contact with Anna, checking in on her progress and ensuring that the changes were taking hold. But it wasn't just the business side of things that was improving. There was a noticeable shift in the culture of the store. Employees smiled more, exchanged friendly banter with customers, and worked together as a cohesive team rather than just a group of individuals trying to get through the day. A month later, Mark made an unannounced visit to the store. He wanted to see with his own eyes just how much had changed. As he walked in, he was immediately struck by the warm atmosphere. The store was clean, well-organized, and bustling with activity. Employees greeted him with smiles, and the customers were happy, their interactions with the staff friendly and efficient. Mark's eyes found Anna almost immediately. She was standing by the front counter, helping a customer pick out a jacket. Her face was radiant, and her smile was genuine. It was clear that she had found a place where she could not only thrive, but also help others do the same. As Mark watched her, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. This was what he had hoped for when he first walked into the store in disguise. The transformation wasn't just about changing the way the store operated. It was about changing the lives of the people who worked there. After finishing his visit, Mark pulled Anna aside for a quick conversation. "You've done a remarkable job, Anna," he said, his voice full of appreciation. "I couldn't be more proud of what you've accomplished. This place is a reflection of your leadership. I hope you know that." Anna's eyes shone with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mark. You gave me the chance I needed. I'll make sure this store continues to thrive." As Mark walked out of the store that day, he reflected on everything that had happened. The journey had been one of discovery, of confronting uncomfortable truths, and of making difficult decisions. But in the end, he had learned something invaluable. The real strength of a business lies in the people who build it, Mark thought to himself, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He had finally understood the most important lesson. It wasn't just about the bottom line. It was about the people who made that line possible. And for them, he would always fight for what was right. With that, he left the store, confident that the future of the business and the people who worked there was in good hands.
Have you ever experienced something similar? Share your thoughts. Subscribe now and never miss a story that will leave you speechless.